Being first often is a huge deal for siblings. Whether it's being first to get dinner, first to use the bathroom in the morning, or first to get to the car, and therefore gaining access to the all important front seat, being first is sometimes all that matters in the never ending rivalry of siblings. In the second half of the 20th century, being first in space exploration was a huge deal for the two competing superpowers of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union. However, in contrast to the relatively piddling battle with your younger brother, supremacy over the skies above was seen as an all important strategic advantage in the quiet conflict between the Americans and the Soviets. After World War II, tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States grew increasingly acrimonious as the two scrambled for allies and influence throughout the world. The typical narrative this rivalry took often pitted their competing economic models against one another. The Soviet Union had implemented a rigid, centrally controlled command economy based on principles of communism. Everything from the production of factories to the crops each farmer could plant was regulated and controlled by the Central Soviet government. The United States, on the other hand, embraced the free market economic system called capitalism that most countries in the world utilize in some form today. Both countries encouraged the spread of these systems, and the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in numerous proxy wars, whether it was secretly in the shadowy world of espionage and counterintelligence, or through active conflict like in the Korean Peninsula or in Vietnam. Despite this hostile environment, the two countries never actually squared off in full-scale battle. This Cold War, as it is known, caused the two countries to build up their militaries and weapons caches to enormously high levels in case war between the two ever did break out. The advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver a nuclear payload and obliterate entire regions and make them unlivable for decades only heightened the stakes of the silent war between the two countries. It was with these grave circumstances in mind that both the United States and the Soviet Union looked to outer space as yet another area to fight over. Outer space and the skies in general were of particular importance. If one country gained a significant advantage over the other, they could seemingly have the power to drop bombs on the other at will, eliminating their foe and millions of people in a matter of minutes. While these potential military factors were important, the space race had an even larger symbolic importance. The space race was important to both governments as a symbol of technological superiority over the other, and both the Soviet and American public followed the various successes and failures of both governments intently. The event which is considered the starting point of the space race was the Soviet launch of the satellite Sputnik in October of 1957. Sputnik was a small metallic satellite, about the size of a beach ball, which orbited the Earth, sent radio signals back to Russia, and could be seen with the naked eye. This terrified the American public. There was now an enemy craft directly overhead. Only a month later, the Soviets launched a second craft into orbit, this one carrying a dog, Laika. The successful launches surprised the American government as well. They responded with a flurry of action as President Eisenhower created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, the following year, and in January of 1958 hurried to launch their own satellite, Explorer 1. Despite this, the Soviets were the first to reach the next major benchmark, putting a human into orbit safely. In April of 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth in outer space and return safely, orbiting the Earth in 108 minutes aboard the capsule Vostok 1. A month later, the first American, Alan Shepard, reached outer space. It took another year for the Americans to launch their first astronaut into orbit. The Americans were losing the space race at every turn. This is partially what made President Kennedy's remarks in May of 1961 so surprising. In Congress, Kennedy announced the ambitious plan that the United States would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade and do it before the Soviet Union did. Within a few short years, both the United States and the Soviet Union had begun programs specifically designed to deal with the problems of deep space flight and lunar landing and takeoff. Both programs, the American Apollo program and the Soviet Soyuz program, became the chief goals of their respective aeronautics agencies. Both suffered tragedy and setbacks. For instance, in January of 1967, 3 American astronauts died in a fire during a launch simulation. Despite these obstacles, the Americans struck first in the race to the moon, when Apollo 8 successfully orbited the moon in December of 1968. The most important prize came the following year, when Apollo 11 successfully landed and returned from the moon, with Neil Armstrong becoming the first man to walk on the moon, famously stating, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." By landing on the moon first, the Americans effectively won the space race over the Soviets. The Soviets made several failed attempts over the next few years, but never successfully landed a man on the moon. As space exploration continued and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union waned, cooperation became the emphasis between the two countries' space programs. In 1975, an American ship docked with a Soviet orbiting space station, and the ensuing handshake between the two captains was seen as a symbol of the two superpowers' better relations. The space race was important for several reasons. It was important scientifically, as countless sums of money were spent by both the Soviet Union and the United States that advanced aerospace, mechanics, and science in general in leaps and bounds. In just over a decade, mankind went from never having launched anything out of the atmosphere to safely landing and returning a man from the moon. Politically, the space race was yet another proxy battle between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it scored an important psychological victory. Some Americans now truly believed their country was technologically superior to the Soviet Union, and, if nothing else, beating the Soviets to the moon became a national point of pride.